Thanks, guys. That was an awesome presentation. But if you want to stay up on the stage, Sammy and I, we're going to have a bit of a debate. Anybody else who wants to come on stage is welcome. We're going to talk about root network emissions. Rob, you might have some perspective on this. Some thoughts.
I always got perspective for you. You know.
We should get Nick up here as well.
Let's get Nick up.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
Okay, so everyone's welcome to jump up on stage and participate in the conversation. But like, let me frame the conversation question. Going back almost a year when we first proposed dynamic TAO, the original design didn't have a root network at all. The root network was removed. So for those of you that have played the RAW games, one can imagine what it would be like in a situation where there was no root network. Well, specifically, you would have to stake into a subnet that has a Uniswap pool between your balance and the stake, the TAO that's staked. And there's no quote unquote risk-free option by staking into subnet 0. Now, by bringing that in, we allayed a lot of fears from people in the community that were worried about, not understanding how they would be able to play this game and worried about the fact that they would just be dominated by power users and still wanting to participate in the staking process of Bittensor. So we brought the root network in, and this allowed individuals to stake onto root, and their weight in the root network would be reflected in all of the subnets on Bittensor. I'll explain how that would occur mathematically, but it would then allow them to still make dividends as like almost airdrops across all of the 64 to 1024 subnets on Bittensor, giving you an APY without your principal being affected or at any point at risk in the ecosystem. One of the consequences of the design also is that if you stake on root alone, because of the way that we calculate the stake weight in the consensus algorithm of any subnet, it's 50% comes from the local subnet token, and 50% comes from a global calculation of all of your holdings across all subnets, including root. This meant that if you only had root, your dividends would be about 50% lower than somebody that had actually allocated 100% of their TAO into all of the subnets on Bittensor. So there's still an incentive to participate in dynamic TAO, to be inside of the subnets. But there is a lower APY if you don't participate, and a higher APY if you do. In the game, you could say that we're creating. One more thing here is that if we do allow root, then that stake counts as economic security inside of the subnets. Whereas if we were to remove the risk-free option, a lot of people might just hold their TAO off of any staking account. And because of that, the economic security, which is what the proof of stake inside of each of the subnets, would be reduced by how much TAO is no longer staked into the on-risk positions inside the network. So there's the framework, but we were talking about this in RAW, and I think it's a reasonable conversation to have on stage with the other participants, Nick, Sammy, Fish, Dave Fields, Josh, Caro. Yeah, I'll step back.
Before you pass it off, could you describe at a high level what happens with the TAO that's staked to root? Like, how does that load through the subnets? I think that would be very valuable.
Right. Okay. So inside of a subnet, we apply Yuma Consensus. And Yuma Consensus is a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid, which pays miners for proof of work. That's the incentive term, right? And it pays validators for being in consensus. That's the dividend term. And the combination of those terms is emission, E. Now, the incentive to stay in alignment comes from the dividends. And basically, it pays the validators for being close to the consensus. Now, it pays them in proportion to the amount of stake they have. So if I have 1 million tau and you have 100,000 tau, I'll have 10 times the amount of emission in terms of dividends from my 1 million stake. So people are familiar with that concept. And it needs to be roughly linear, or else the validators will have no incentive to stay in consensus, and therefore would just arbitrarily pick miners and send them emission effectively. So in the dynamic tau world, there is the local stake inside of a subnet, alpha, beta, delta, epsilon, gamma, etc. If we purely ran the proof of stake inside of a subnet, the economic security, like the economic security comes from the total, dollar terms cost it would take to accumulate 51% of the stake weight in a network, is split by the number of subnets effectively, right? On average, it'll be 1/64 times less economic security inside of a subnet because all of the value has been split across all of these different tokens. And so inside of the original paper, the way that we solve this problem is by having the weight that a validator gets inside of a subnet to be equivalent to a combination of two terms. One term being basically the proportion of the alpha token that you have relative to everyone else. So, if I have 10% of alpha tokens, that value would be 0.1. And the other term would be effectively the sum total of all of my subnet tokens everywhere else when denominated in tau. And the combination of those two terms would give you weight because you had subnet tokens everywhere. And also would mean that the economic security of a subnet was only half, right? Because 50% of the weight in the consensus came from everywhere rather than just locally. So you would actually be slightly more than half because it would be also the economic security of the alpha token or the beta token. Because we need to give dividends in proportion to the weight, this means that we would give dividends in proportion to your global weight in the subnet, right? So this other section of what gives you weight inside of a subnet, the global term, being 50% of the weight, would then acquire 50% of the dividends. So 50% of the dividends inside of a subnet go to everybody in the entire network, let's say. When you include the root network, if I'm holding, say, 1 million tau on the root network, and that's, say, like 50% of all the tau everywhere else, I would get 25% of the dividends in every subnet, right? Because half, 1 million over 2 million, divided by 50% of the dividends, right? So that's the structure. And maybe, Sammy, you have some questions about why and how, or if you want to dive down into a little bit more of the mathematics.
Yeah, so effectively does going back to your example, if somebody was to stake 1 million tau to the root network, is that evenly split across all the subnets, and then within a subnet also evenly split across all the validators, or does it just default to one validator?
Let's imagine this is an example. Let's imagine that there's only me and you, Sammy. And I am exclusively staking my 1 million tau. I don't have 1 million tau. But let's say I was staking, there's only 2 million tau, and you have 1 million. And I have the other 1 million, and I'm staking it entirely into root. And you have split it across the two subnets in Bittensor. So you have 500,000 tau and 500,000 tau in the other subnet. Does that make sense? You can imagine the situation?
Yeah.
Right. So your global weight is the same as mine. Right. So you would get a score of 0.5 for the global term in every subnet, right? Because you have 1 million tau, I have 1 million tau, and there's 2 million tau, and there's 1.5. So that's 0.5. Does it make sense? Right.
Yeah.
But the difference is that you have 100% of both alpha and beta, right? So your stake weight is actually 1 plus 0.5 over 2. So you actually have 75% of the stake weight in both subnets, and I only have 25. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So your dividends, even though you have 1,000,000 tau and I have 1,000,000 tau, your dividends will actually be 3 times as large as mine.
Okay, so I guess thinking about it like this, the tau that's staked to the root network isn't actually being sent into the liquidity pools of each subnet evenly, right? It's more of just the global tau term that's allowing them to generate the yield.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So there will be for your whole basket of goods, you own some subnet tokens all over the place, but you also have some root. There'll be a way of calculating how much tau that's all worth.
Yeah.
And
so
that's carried with you everywhere.
Yeah. So the point you raised about how, stake on the root network, adds value in the sense of economic security is a great point. But the fact that these root stakers are earning yield as well, and a large amount of yield just for that economic security, and they're not even the tau that they're contributing isn't even deepening liquidity within the liquidity pools, and at the same time, if they do choose to sell, it almost seems like it hurts the subnet owners more than it does benefit them, kind of in the long run.
I'm actually not so worried about the sell pressure versus the buy pressure for the subnet tokens. It will reach some equilibrium, and then people will be making market decisions based upon that equilibrium, whether or not it sums to one or not. The issue, I think, is more that there's all of this liquidity that is, as you said, not in the liquidity pools, not participating in the mechanism, not really helping us produce a functioning market. It's just kind of sitting there, right? Does that make sense?
That's where I guess you articulated my worry a lot better. So it's not really helping the whole dTAO system run. Initially, I was imagining that if you did stake to root, then the tau would flow into the subnets or into the subnet liquidity pools, and it'd be adding value in that sense, helping the system basically operate more smoothly. But it sounds like that's not really happening either.
Not really possible. Otherwise, if it goes into a liquidity pool, it becomes available for people to purchase at all sorts of different prices, and therefore, they might as well just be participating. The original design, if we can think through the implications of the design. So in the design where there is no root network, if you have tau and you're seeking an APY, you must allocate it to effectively potentially highly volatile assets. We don't know exactly what the volatility will be. It's hard to determine, but we all know that there will be risk implied, and it's not obvious how that game will play out. So many people don't want to play that game, and so there will be a lot of tau that is already not, you could say, participating. That will just be and in fact, I know large holders that will just go, look, I'm just going to hold it on my balance, right? So that loss of liquidity might just be a consequence of the design altogether. Sammy, does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess one way I was thinking about it was that if there was no option to earn any type of passive risk-free yield, then maybe holders would say take 5% of their total holdings and participate within dTAO in that sense. But if there's some option which allows them and again, I don't know from the simulations that you've run how attractive that yield will be, but if it's 50% less than the max dTAO yield, it sounds like that could be very attractive, much higher than what we have right now. Is that correct?
If nobody participates in dTAO, then the person who does will get exorbitant APY. Let's put it that way, right? Now that doesn't last very long because the dividends that are being made by people on root are actually becoming subnet tokens, right? So, but if everyone is always unstaking, the APY for the person that holds the subnet tokens would just be it would be 50% of the inflation of Bittensor itself, right? So I don't know what that is, and it could effectively be infinitely high, right? Because they could, if they're just the only person who participates and stakes $1 and no one else does, then anyways, you can do the math.
One cons, I put something in the RAW channel to sort of put an example to that, kind of assuming like 10, 30, 50% participation, because I do think that's a really important consideration in what's going to drive participation rates in dTAO. So if you have a scenario where 10% of people are participating in dTAO and 90% are not, the people participating in dTAO on average are making 11x the emissions of people sitting in global. And even at 50% participation rates, you're still making 3x. So I think that that's, to me, feels like a very meaningful driver of participation rates. Versus sort of just getting, because you won't get 50% of what others are getting that are participating. It would be significantly less, especially in like the early participation days.
Those are really nice numbers, Dave, but they're not exactly right, because one needs to keep in mind that the people on root are actually also making dividends in the subnet tokens themselves. Right. So it's this is actually something that we perhaps should do simulations around, Dave.
It's quantifiable. If validators have 41% of the emissions, and within the subnet, the people who have the RAO, the alpha tokens, getting 50% of the stake weight, they're getting, assuming prices are summing to 1, they're getting about 1,500 tau worth of value per day. And that just gets split among the amount of people that are within the subnets holding the alpha tokens.
Yeah, and also people that are holding root, right? That regulates that somewhat.
Well, no, it's 1,500 just for the people holding the alpha tokens, and then 1,500 for the people not holding alpha tokens.
Right.
Yeah, so the numbers are a little simplified, Cons, just because we've sort of been doing some of the simulation stuff. I mean, I think it would be great to do some more detailed simulations around it, because yes, it will counterbalance it a little bit, but the investment in sort of the the alpha tokens, I mean, your 10% participation rate isn't going to drive up enormously with emissions over the course of a few days or a few weeks. Right, over time it will, but those holding global stake might also be immediate sellers, right, of the tokens.
Yes, and this was another thing that we were speaking about, Sammy, is like what will the likely strategy be for these participants that are purely on root? And like you were suggesting that it'll probably just be unstake all, immediate unstake all, and I was saying that you probably wouldn't want to do an immediate unstake all.
Yeah, I think to your point, if let's take a fund that has a large TAO position. If they are bullish on the TAO ecosystem, then it might not make sense to just like insta dump. But if we're assuming that like these root stakers aren't really going to be like deep into the actual ecosystem, then when it comes time to actually take their profits, or say like coming up on end of the year, they want to lock some gains in, I don't think they're going to have the expertise to like determine, okay, like this subnet's a scam, or this one is Targon is the leading inference subnet. It's more of just going to be like a sell all rather than like sell subnet XYZ and keep the rest. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's probably true. However, I think there are a large number of people, perhaps in this crowd, and we can maybe hear in the chat, that like even if you were taking the risk-free option, would you participate in unstaking your funds from certain subnets that you think were positive or negative? Like it's sort of like a halfway point, Sammy.
Yeah, I guess the argument I'm making is that they're not going to know which subnets are positive and negative. So it's just going to be like, okay, cool. We got some free yield. Let me just sell everything now.
Yeah, imagine like if you got airdrop free tokens that you have never heard of before, chances are you're probably just going to sell it because you never heard of it.
Right.
Yeah, but if you have enough knowledge to be speculating in the dTAO market, like you're going to be playing the dTAO game, not participating passively and then like half playing it.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think what you guys are getting at is like it's a safe assumption to assume that root stakers are just going to sell all subnet tokens. That, you know, it might not be immediately, but when it comes time to like make a decision, are you guys also like behind the idea that most likely it'll just be a sell all?
I think you convinced me, Const, that it's not that not everybody's going to be instant dumping. That it's probably going to be a lot of people holding all. But I agree with Sammy that the decision is going to be sell all or keep all in the vast majority of cases.
I reckon that's true. However, there are a lot of pretty major holders in the Bittensor ecosystem that won't want to actively play the game, but follow Bittensor pretty closely. And I mean, this is effectively a moot point. Like, it's not an argument. It's just something that I imagine will happen. Is that they'll be like, "Oh, I don't know the subnet. I've never heard of them." Whereas, "Oh, I'm going to keep it in, Targon," and because I've heard they're doing something, right, rather than nothing, So, and I also think that there will be a lot more marketing happening on behalf of subnets, which could be good or bad, and that may sway people's opinions. Like even in the periphery of their mind, they might choose to participate slightly in the market dynamics of dTAO, and they could do so in a very risk-free way. Whereas, like, I'm not going to ever trade in the stock market, maybe, but hey, I've heard of Nvidia, so I'm going to hold on to that.
Yeah, that's fair, Collins, especially if like the landscape ends up like a Pareto distribution and there's like a handful of subnets whose names become very well known and the teams operating them also, there's reputation behind the team, such as Macrocosmos, the Manifold Labs. They might choose to just hold those subnets and then sell whatever they haven't heard of.
Yeah.
I don't really agree with this. I think like the vast majority of tokens that are going to be passively staked are going to be staked by funds, and funds are not going to like do independent diligence, even to a minimal extent on every subnet. I mean, you're going to have to run through, investment committee or whatever if you want to hold on to one of these subnet tokens. Like they're just going to say, for the sake of ease, just dump it all, or we do that and then we participate in dTAO actively.
Right.
Do you think it's even fun?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question, Dave.
Do you think there will be Bittensor only funds where the validators essentially acts as a fund, and they're, instead of investing in other portfolio company, their portfolio companies like universe would just be all the subnets?
I mean, I think this is for sure going to happen. We've seen what Muv built, right? Like Muv will do a fund, I'm sure. Can we hear from Muv in the chat?
We need DTFs, dTAO traded funds.
Nice.
I mean, anything possible.
They're happening. They're happening.
It's going to happen. So, I mean, like, will they perform better than the index? I'm not sure. I actually kind of think that there'll be a lot of mean retention in the initial design. So people that are trying to trade in and outside of that may not perform well. There's things are converging in some sense towards a steady state. It's very exciting. I don't know for you guys, but for me, it's like the most exciting thing. Just when we get to see this play out, like a lot of us are excited. We're excited that OTF. Like, just had to say that.
Yeah, I think another thing it's going to push for is that. I think a lot of the detail will be more evaluated, more online, was kind of like public equities or tokens, where people are going to be asking for KPIs or more data for each individual subnets. So I think we're probably going to see more subnets releasing more data, more dashboards, trying to appeal to the public, like, hey, here's our metrics, here's our KPIs. And we've been improving on, I don't know, revenue, expenses, research metrics that we're trying to optimize, that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Hey,
Let's bring it back.
I have one other question on kind of the detail stuff that we haven't talked about in a little while, which is sort of the initiation sort of moment for the subnets.
Yes.
Is that something we could chat about for a minute?
Yes, let's do it.
Because one thing that I'm concerned about is sort of that initiation moment, because it will actually be like a very low liquidity moment for the subnets. And I know there's been talk about the initial lock cost being what drives it. Other subnet owners have wanted it to be as low as like 100 tau. I think that's something we should really explore and do some simulations around. But if you just think about like 100 tau initialization of the subnet, for someone to get more than 100 tau, worth of their alpha token will be very easy to do. So the more tau someone initiates into their subnet, kind of the more liquidity there will be in that pool. And so I've sort of been thinking about whether it might make sense for subnet owners to actually have an ability to invest as much tau as they would like into the inception moment. Maybe there's a cap, maybe there's some lockups, but I think that's a really important thing. And I've seen some of these ecosystems like dTAO and Friendtech, where that initiation moment kind of was done poorly. And, it really created some problems, for the longevity of the chain.
Yeah, it is actually the most difficult thing. And, unfortunately, like unlike us, when we launched Bittensor, it was very organic. But if a lot more people had been watching, right, maybe we wouldn't have been able to even mine our own token, So like, thankfully, it was very grassroots. It won't be the same with subnets on Bittensor. There'll be like a whole market of people, a whole group of miners that are going to jump on your subnets initially and try to mine them from inception and things like this. So we have not finalized that very core problem of the design, but where I have leaned to more in talks with subnet owners is actually just to stick with the 18% or something around 18%. So then it really becomes less of a question for a subnet owner about how they're going to mine their initial subnet, what they're going to lock or unlock or inject, and how much they're going to buy initially, because these questions become very, very difficult for people to answer. And it becomes a really difficult economic question for someone to answer alongside the problem of, how am I just going to, make a really well-functioning design on Bittensor? This actually came from Will from Macrocosmos. He said, just like leave it at 18%. And then a subnet owner will know like how much they're going to have after X amount of time. It does irk me, the arbitrary nature of a number like 18%. And it actually does come up to be a very, very large proportion of the initial token distribution for a subnet owner, which could be negative for the project itself, if that makes sense, Dave. But there's just consistency and obviousness and simplicity to something like that might be really good. However, we really still are iterating on that design. Okay, so to your point though, like letting the subnet owner buy as much as they want, at what price? That's always the question. And if it's like 1/n for the subnets, what you can do very easily is just buy all of the initial distribution of your token, right? Like if it really is 1/n, like we read this a number of times, like for 1,000 tau, if there's 100 subnets, it's 100,000 initial, and then the 100,000 initial becomes like 700,000 of this subnet token by the end of the year out of 1 million, right? So do you see how it can kind of get out of control if you let people modulate that term?
Yeah, no, I think it's why the simulations around it are critical, because, part of what, I mean, dTAO is one that I'm very familiar with. I was actually, kind of an early investor there. And, the initial sort of moment with BitClout, people were sort of able to get in before, kind of the public, which was super problematic. But even just having sort of that early release moment, and there were sort of all of these creator coins that were, driven up by handfuls of people who were in first, you then started to attract other, people into the ecosystem. And it was a real, sort of negative on kind of entrance into it. So I just think it's important consideration. I mean, the 18% makes, some sense to me, as a starting point, but I think it's a really worthwhile thing to run a number of, simulations around. We're doing some stuff in that area, and I'm happy to share, what we kind of come up with there.
Yeah, for sure. There is also another aspect here where we do believe that it might make sense to allow subnet owners to choose the point where they turn on the emissions for their subnet in conjunction with 18%, or even to turn it down or up, to pick the point where they want to have a minor inflation in their network, which would allow them to actually just buy the token continuously and not have other people dilute them, except for the other people that are buying it, right? So it very quickly becomes a market-based thing. If in that event, right, if everybody just buys the token from this initial liquidity, and you bought it yourself and you can't get it anymore, that's because people have bought it and you can sell, right? So you can't lose in that design as a subnet owner, right? So yeah, these things are super really good questions, Dave. Thank you so much for bringing it up.
Hey, Jake. Quick question about the turning up and down on the emission, right? My understanding is that if you turn down the emission, it's only for the miners. The validators still get their full take, right?
We think it'd be better if everybody were to lose out, both validators, subnet owners, and miners.
Yeah. Likewise, I think that's a good idea. I was just telling Alex, I was like, this is a really important. I think this is a really important tool. Like if you push an update, right, like on V4, right, and maybe there's like a exploit that you didn't catch, right, turning down the emission, right, and then almost like a Fed funds rate, like where it's like a lever, where it's like, okay, we know that the subnet is working really well. The code is like bona fide. There's no exploits. Like we can up the incentive or the emission that's going out so that we can attract more miners, right? But if there's like a glut of miners, I don't know if we're going to keep the 256 on the miner side or like the UID limit, but imagine like it's an infinite amount of miners, right? You could increase the emission to 100%, and then you could get a lot more miners, right? But then it's like, okay, we have too many miners, right? So it allows for I think it's an important tool to have as a subnet owner.
Yeah. I agree. And I think one of the reasons why we want that mechanism in place is just comes from the fact that we know that the first thing that subnet owners will attempt to do is try to limit the inflation that goes to people that are selling, for instance, and like this will be kind of a pressure valve for that sort of maybe malicious or non-productive approach to running your subnet. So it's just, if you don't think of things in alignment, like you can turn down the emission and let it build up slowly. But that being said, you're not turning off the emission that's going into the pool, like that's consistent, and so you can't just modulate the arbitrarily and see if you can push
your price.
Yeah. So there's still you can't withhold people from participating in your mechanism. And like this is one of the main reasons why we had all of this like global TAO as well, is because we needed to make it so that you can't create kind of like a cancerous subnet in Bittensor that's not getting some seeding from the actual ecosystem of TAO in the first place. So one thing that will happen is that we'll all come to own sections of all of the subnets in Bittensor, which I think could be very cool, right? You'll see that people are like, oh, I really want this subnet to succeed because I've held my ownership over time.
Yeah. By the way, am I a robot right now?
Yeah, a bit.
Okay. Let me see if I can fix that. But thank you. I appreciate it.
I think another thing that will be interesting is that instead of buying like the token for your pool, you can maybe just buy liquidity. Maybe not even buy liquidity, but owners can put in how much tally they want to put in there. So, and these get converted 1-to-1, not converted, but you also get 1-to-1 with dTAO. So the more you put in, the more liquidity you have, and maybe the less volatility you have on day one of dTAO.
Mm-hmm. That's it. Yes, I mean the question is obviously the initial distribution. What alpha token do you get in return? And yeah, Fish, did you have something to say?
No, I think I've been unmuted. I just shared our commit for our speed up in the dendrite though. Basically,
That's
just
That's off topic.
Not related though.
Yeah. So great, Dave. Nick, Sammy.
Yeah, just to clear something up. I think you said it already, but I just wanted to clarify to make sure. So there's no like passive TAO that's coming from the root stakers that are actually going into the dynamic TAO tokens, right?
What do you mean going into?
Like when you stake to root, the TAO that's going into root is not that you're staking is not like allocated to the liquidity pools for dTAO.
No.
Okay, that's super helpful. So I think then what you were saying before, Const, about like concern about like people choosing, like not choosing or like negatively selecting subnets isn't as big of a deal then, because you have like, I mean, like you don't really need anybody to like short effectively the subnets, because the only people who are going to be in them are people who are going to have wanted to hold the token in some regard. So you kind of have like that information already coming in from that side.
That's not quite right, because note the people that are staked to root will be getting dividends in all the subnets in the subnet token. So they will come to actually be allocated into these subnets and hold outstanding alpha, beta, delta, epsilon, and gamma, right? So even though they started off with this passive, now they actually hold a basket of goods that is volatile after time, but their principle never changed, right? So that's is that in alignment with the way you understood it?
Gotcha. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I'll have to think about that one, but I just wanted to say, like, I think I misunderstood a fair bit of it, and I think a lot of people did. But understanding like this kind of square root function for the total proportion of TAO stake to root versus dTAO, determining the APY there, and then the global economic stake component really set my mind at ease on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's a great takeaway. I'm going to go and do some analysis, and then next time we'll get on novelty search, we'll have better numbers for exactly that ratio and how it works out. But it feels like the call's over, and that's great. So let's end it here. Yo, Caro, Josh, amazing work. Super fascinating, super excited for what you guys have been building, and looking forward to trying it out on Cursor myself. Thanks for coming up on stage. Everyone else as well. Absolutely. Sammy, Dave, Fish, Nick, Pigeon. Thanks for coming, everyone, and have a good night.